respected speaker. Good evening, sir. Accept my greetings from India, and I would like to introduce you now, and it's my privilege to introduce you. And thank you so much for being a part of this faculty development program.
Thank
Kenneth
you for
Valpey.
having me.
Kenneth Valpey, also known as Krishna Kshetra Swami, is a research fellow of the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies and the Dean of Studies at Bhaktivedanta College, Sefton, Belgium. He is also a fellow of the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics and a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the Bhaktivedanta Research Centre, Kolkata and Mumbai. As a practicing monk in the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition, he has been engaged since 1972 in ISKCON missionary activities, mainly in Europe, and the study and teaching of Indic cultural and religious ideas and practices, including teaching at the University of Florida, Chinese University of Hong Kong, and University of Pula, Croatia. After completing his DPhil PhD at the University of Oxford with a study of Vaishnava temple liturgical practices and theology, published by Routledge in 2006 as Attending Krishna's Image Chaitanya Vaishnava Murti Seva as Devotional Truth. He has been co-directing an extended research project of the OCHS on the Bhagavata Purana, of which he has presently completed together with Dr. Ravi M. Gupta an abridged translation for Columbia University Press. His latest book, Cow Care in Hindu Animal Ethics, has been published as an open access edition in the Palgrave Macmillan Animal Ethics monograph series, receiving 36,000 downloads in the first year of publication. Sir, I would like to welcome you for this session and hope we will be really very much benefited by your lecture. Kindly take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goswami. And I want to express my appreciation of Professor Amya Sen's presentation just now. And I want to acknowledge and appreciate that Professor Sen has been a visiting fellow of the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. So it's very nice to see you here. And I feel honored to be speaking in your presence. And I hope in particular, I may get some response from you, Professor Sen. I want to also thank all of the organizers, especially the Department of History of St. Xavier's College and all of the other institutes that are collaborating for this. I think it's interesting that in this period of the COVID pandemic, something good is coming out of it in the sense that we can have such conferences where so many of us can come together from all over the world. The practice of comparison in the study of religion is a somewhat contentious matter, or perhaps a very contentious matter. My basic starting point is to say that all knowledge, indeed all thinking, involves some form or another of comparison. The professor of religion, the late Professor Houston Smith, said, logically, everything is both like and unlike everything else. So comparing as such cannot be an issue. Certain kinds of comparison are the issue, particularly in the study of religion. But more broadly, perhaps we need to ask, why study religion? For me, the study of religion is a practice of moving carefully and with intentionality along the borderline between the finite and the infinite. This is an extremely rich borderline that I would argue we as the human community ignore at our own peril. In the context of cultural studies, the study of religion may be said to be where the human quest for meaning extends to its farthest reaches, and where that quest can serve to bring us humans, with our endlessly varied perspectives, closer and more deeply together. Significantly, the Sanskrit word for meaning is artha, which also means value and purpose. To study religion in the academy is important and integral to cultural studies, and I believe such study must always be resistant to reductive approaches, for while reductive approaches may claim to explain religion, they tend instead to explain it away, thereby denying people their meanings and hence resulting in forms of colonization. Since our general topic of this program is research methods in social sciences with focus on cultural studies, I want to express a word of caution about method and methodology in the study of religion. As, again, Houston Smith so aptly put it, quote, any method we fix on will be hedged by blinders that create tunnel vision. He goes on to say, we always know more than we know how we know it, from which it follows that to channel our knowledge through methods we are explicitly aware of restricts our field of vision, unquote. And this, Smith goes on to say, quote, is not fair to our subject or to our students, or even by the university's professed commitment to objectivity, is to give our students the impression that our enlightenment vectored courses show them what religion, or I would add culture or society, objectively is, unquote. This is because our methods are invariably incomplete. There is, fortunately, a contemporary scholarly interest in the unknowably more of human experience, and this owes much, according to Mary Dunn, another scholar of religion, to the 19th century American philosopher and psychologist William James, who said, quote, reality exceeds our logic, overflows and surrounds it, unquote. He affirmed further, the ultimate opacity of things, a dimension of being which escapes our theoretical control, unquote. And he argued that we know more than we can perceive by means of either our sensate or logical faculties. As one way of possibly overcoming, to some extent, the tendency toward tunnel vision, I want to set forth the method of comparison, or I should better say, a method of comparison. To get a sense of the value of comparison, I suggest an analogy, whereby analogies are also forms of comparison, namely our normal condition of physical viewing with two eyes. Because of the parallax from having 2 points of perspective, which we blend in our brain, we experience depth of field, which enables us to understand our own position in relation to what we view. A common objection to comparison is summarized in the English expression, you can't compare apples and oranges. But of course, we can compare apples and oranges if we understand the purpose and the process. In this simple example, the purpose can be understood can be to understand something more about apples or about oranges. A third possible purpose is to illuminate our enterprise in making the comparison, to ask the question why we are making the comparison. Related to this is then to understand something more about ourselves, whether in relation to apples, oranges, fruit in general, or the enterprise of comparison. The point here is that whatever the purpose of comparison may be, the process of comparing, even if it is just apples and oranges, must be with respect to a third object. This third object is most generally an abstraction, such as, in this case, weight, color, market value, chemical content, or what have you. And understanding this principle of triangulation enables a fourth purpose of comparison, namely to illuminate the abstraction with the particulars of the comparison. In this example, to learn something specific about the idea of weight or of color and so on from examining apples and oranges together. This crude example of comparing physical objects is meant to help us see that good, meaningful comparison is possible, by which important knowledge can be gained. In the study of religion, this is particularly important and also particularly challenging. The process of comparison of religious traditions has been carefully and systematically undertaken, amongst other efforts, in the work of Professor Robert Cummings Neville and his colleagues in the Boston University Comparative Religious Ideas Project, conducted in the late 1990s to 2000. There were some 20 scholars involved over a 3-year period, producing 3 volumes. As the title of this project indicates, these scholars specifically restricted themselves to the comparison of religious ideas in order to avoid entering into an overwhelmingly complex task. Some of this comparative religious ideas project's principles I have found helpful in my own work, specifically my doctoral research on the practice of temple worship ritual culture in the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition, out of which has come my book, Attending Krishna's Image, Chaitanya Vaishnava Murti Seva as Devotional Truth. I also made significant changes to their approach. So, for example, whereas Neville and colleagues made comparisons across major religious traditions, such as between Christian and Hindu or between Buddhist and Jewish traditions, my approach was to examine 2 iterations of essentially the same tradition, the Chaitanya or Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition of Bengal. Also, rather than limiting myself to theological ideas in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, my attention was on theological ideas in relation with physical temple images and the rituals and other related practices associated with the images. I essentially compared 2 specific Chaitanya Vaishnava temples, one Krishna temple in Vrindavan, founded in the 16th century, an embodied community, and one Krishna temple outside London, founded in 1973, a missionizing community. But what was the abstraction about which I compared them? It was what Neville and colleagues called one of three fuzzy categories of comparison, namely religious truth. The other two categories that they used being the human condition and ultimate realities. These are called fuzzy categories because they are intentionally broad and minimally predefined. Religious truth, something largely dismissed by modernity and postmodernity as irrelevant, is, I argue, crucial to be taken seriously if one is to pursue understanding of religious communities. And to approach the idea of religious truth meaningfully is to specify it through the understandings and practices of specific communities, especially as placed in dynamic relationship through the act of comparison. Further, it means to keep open the notion of religious truth to the broadest possible extent of the tradition's understandings. For Neville and colleagues, this has meant to recognize three dimensions of religious truth. And here I'll say something briefly about these three dimensions. First is religious truth as epistemological problem, the opposite of which is error, the form of which is further comprehended in terms of reference, objects of right knowledge, what in Sanskrit would be called prameya, meaning, which could be referenced as pramana, and means of engagement or prama. And each of these three aspects of religious truth as epistemological problem should be seen as having different ranges of articulation. For example, from static to dynamic understandings of reference, ordinary to extraordinary meaning, and propositions to holistic enactments as means of engagement. Second, religious truth as expressed in sacred texts and objects, the opposite of which is, interestingly enough, deceit, deception. It involves various types of texts involving various types and degrees of authority within communities, and also involves objects, including mantra, murti, music, dance, drama, ritual, buildings, and so on. And a third dimension of religious truth is religious truth as cultivation and embodiment, the opposite of which is, interestingly enough, failure. This dimension involves questions of how a religious practitioner's character is enriched, elevated, transformed in order to register the higher truth or truths, and questions of embodiment, how the practitioner is affected by engagement with the truth or truths. Here, taking as an example from the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, affect may range from rudimentary faith, shraddha, to profound transformative divine love, prema. So how did I go about this comparison of two Krishna temples with respect to what we are calling religious truth? My specific focus was on a particular Sanskrit ritual text, Hari Bhakti Vilasa, compiled by Gopal Bhatta Goswami, the founder of the Radharaman temple in Vrindavan in the 16th century, and the engagement of present-day practitioners, especially temple priests, with this text, both in this temple in Vrindavan and in the temple outside London, which I studied, Bhaktivedanta Manor. This involved essentially interviewing priests in both places and observing daily and festival practices in both. Time and other constraints prevented me from engaging with temple visitors to the extent I would have liked to, but the time I was able to spend with priests allowed me to encourage them to be reflective about their activities as temple priests and more broadly about their life situations and identities. The results of my study involved discerning subtle differences in emphasis with respect to a particular polarity of meaning in the process of Krishna worship, namely, on one end of the polarity, the concern for right behavior in the form of careful observance of prescribed rituals, vidhi, and on the other end of the polarity, the fostering of simple, unconstrained attraction to Krishna, raga. The multifaceted matrix of factors in these two temple cultures yielded an extremely rich perspective on the practices of Krishna Bhakti that I believe served well all of the four purposes of comparison of which I have spoken. On the level of social meaning, as I mentioned previously, the two temple communities under study could be usefully identified as, in the case of the Vrindavan Radharaman temple, an embodied community in which hereditary birthright-based identity as priests is an essential principle for maintaining continuity, and a missionizing community in the case of the London temple. Thus, with respect to my abstraction for comparison, religious truth, one could speak of embodied truth and missionizing truth, with considerable implications for the notion of religious truth. In particular, one could discern a sort of inverse relationship concerning structure and anti-structure, or rigidity and flexibility. Radharaman, with its rigid priestly inheritance-based social structure, seemed to make considerable space for flexibility in details of temple worship. For example, timing of worship events, decoration, music, and so on. Whereas the London temple showed somewhat the opposite, with its open social structure seeming to demand considerable rigidity in daily practices. In my particular example of comparison in the study of religion, I selected two Chaitanyite Vaishnava temples. In this sense, the focus was very narrow, two temples from the same tradition. Yet in other respects, one can say that they are worlds apart, geographically, historically, in terms of their social and cultural contexts. My particular interest was to better understand the practice of Murti Seva in the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition, possibly to serve in the broader interest of facilitating educated articulation by practitioners of their own practice, so within the tradition. At the end of my research, incidentally, in Vrindavan, one senior priest of the Radharaman temple told me, he kind of confessed to me that he had decided as a result of my asking him so many questions over the months that I had stayed there about Archana and Puja, he had decided to start a school for pujaris in North India because he said they don't know anything. I found that a common area of concern in these two temple communities could be identified with the fuzzy category religious truth as articulated by the Boston University Comparative Religious Ideas Project. What emerged from the study was a threefold understanding, or what I call construals, of religious truth. That goes beyond the threefold typology given by the Religious Studies Project. And I'll go through these very briefly before I come to an end. First, Religious truth as the purposive pursuit of felicity conditions, conditions favorable for realizing religious truth. This construal involves focus on rules as means of establishing the felicity conditions for experiencing the truth of Krishna Bhakti. Injunctive texts, special qualifications to worship, avoidance of error, deceit, and failure. Second, religious truth as relegation, with emphasis on the dialectic tension between apparently opposite principles in Krishna Bhakti, where the emphasis is on narrative texts describing exemplary devotees and their actions as solutions to oppositions, or murti as enacting and responding to enactments of exemplary devotees, or encountering error, deceit, and failure, thereby giving impetus toward raga, spontaneous devotion. And third, religious truth as lila, divine participation with emphasis on unrestrained and unstrained performance, hence emphasis on aimless or purposeless performance of devotional acts, participation in Krishna's pleasure, the place of irony in discovery of religious truth, how Leela comprehends and incorporates error, deceit, and failure. And now just about 3 more sentences. Coming back to the study of religion in relation to cultural studies, I want to suggest that there is value in recovering the meaning of culture that was prevalent before the late 18th century. As Raymond Williams has pointed out, prior to this, culture had meant primarily the, quote, tending of natural growth, unquote. Thus, if we are interested in the human enterprise in the broadest sense, and indeed human in relation with the environment, then cultivation of our potentials as human beings may be an important correlate to which I suggest the study of religion needs to be included, a study which can benefit from careful, skillfully done comparison. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. So, I have some queries, so which I would like to share with you, and with my meager understanding, what I have understood. So, kindly enlighten me. And as I have already confessed that I am a novice in this field, but still I am trying to learn or trying to upgrade my knowledge. And in the meantime, I request the participants, if you have any question, kindly type in the chat box. So, sir, what I feel like, can religious truths be considered as priorities? This is my first doubt. And uh, second, I think, like, what I would like to know from you, is it possible to construct the praxis of religious studies based on experiences, or it has to be guided by structuralism or positivism? And the third query which I have is, eschatology depict any cultural hegemony? And the last doubt, or like the last, what I would like to say, query which I have, is it possible to apply hermeneutic method to have an understanding of the Leela or Krishna Bhakti?
These are all very big questions, madam.
I may sound futile, but I thought that.
No, they're very nice. Can religious truth be considered a priority? I assume you mean in the study of religion. I would say for the most part, it is put very much in the background of most academic study of religion. I was very happy to see that this Boston University project put it forward as a priority, but not as an exclusive priority. As I mentioned, they identified three, if you like, priorities. One, the human condition. The second, ultimate realities. And this third one of religious truth. Surely one could find one can find probably unlimited sorts of principles which one could put into position as the priority about which one wishes to study. We have scholars who study, for example, religious violence, because this is a big concern, particularly in relation to politics. And on, any number of possibilities. My own interest in religious truth stems perhaps from my own personal religious upbringing, and also an interest in this, let's say, the theological side of the study of religion. At the same time, understanding something about a distinction between the two. But to just say religious truth should be the priority, I think I wouldn't be in a position to say that. I think Mahatma Gandhi might have said something like that. We just heard from Professor Sain that he said truth is God. So he may have wanted to phrase it in a different way with respect to this comparative project, but in any case, he might have gone in that direction. Your second question was about experience, and absolutely, religious experience can be an important, can be an essential focus for the study of religion. The late Professor Ninian Smart identified 7 dimensions of religion: the doctrinal, the institutional, the ethical, the mythical, and experiential, the material, and so on. So experience is for sure an important, if not for many, the most important aspect of religion to be attended to, and therefore application of ethnography, anthropology, of psychology, all of these areas can be applied effectively in the study of religious experience. Your third question, I'm sorry, I missed the first part. It's about cultural hegemony.
Yes, sir, I just repeat it. Is eschatology depicting any cultural hegemony?
Eschatology?
Yes, yes, sir. I may
Uh-huh.
pronounce it wrong. I'm sorry.
Well, I'd have to think about this. Eschatology, of course.
I don't think there's any correlation between the two.
Yeah, I don't think we have to bring a correlation there. Eschatology is a concern about, well, there's different ways of looking at it. And of course, the term is elaborated particularly in Christian theology. But I don't know that we would have to say, if we talk about eschatology or what happens at the end times, if such thing exists, that we have to necessarily speak about cultural hegemony. I would be cautious. In any case, your final question had to do with hermeneutics. And again, if you can remind me what specifically.
Yes. So the final question which I would like to ask you, is it possible to apply hermeneutic method to have an understanding of the Leela or Krishna Bhakti?
Okay. Yes, why not? Now, hermeneutics is itself a huge topic.
Yes. What is the hermeneutic method? There is no the hermeneutic method.
There is no the hermeneutic method. There's any number of hermeneutic methods. I would say like this, just to, put a handle on it for the moment. The modern or postmodern hermeneutics of suspicion, which dominates or has dominated the academy, the humanities to a large extent, I feel needs to be put not front and center, but needs to be set at least significantly to the side to allow for the religious truth, to allow the possibility that Krishna Lila is telling us something, is not simply covering over some hidden, social and psychological influences and power moves and so on. I would just leave it at that. Perhaps Professor Sain would like to say something more.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate, as my knowledge is limited, but still how you have tried to guide me. And sometimes I may sound like as I am asking any question which doesn't make any sense, but for my understanding, whatever today I have gathered definitely will
No,
help.
they're very good questions.
You don't have to be so apologetic. I mean, it's so
yes, no
okay.
need.
So what I feel like, that when we are learning something, sometimes, that our understanding is limited, is meager, but with the help of our mentors, we can enhance our understanding or broaden the scope of knowing more. So we have some questions here. So one question from Sutapa Shadhu. So her question is, how does practice help in understanding the religious studies? Like you are practicing Vaishnava.
That's also a big question. And I would say it's a question that I'm working on as we speak. I don't have a simple formulaic answer to. But what I will say is that in earlier scholarship in the academic study of religion, it was quite common to speak about a sharp divide between the so-called insider and the so-called outsider. And this divide was considered to be more or less unbridgeable, so that the scholarship done by the outsider necessarily, for some, is the only real scholarship. The scholarship done by the insider, so-called, is disqualified, or vice versa. And what's been recognized in recent years is that there's no such simple divide, that every one of us is both an insider and an outsider, more or less, whether we know it or not, in the subject that we are studying, especially with respect to religion. And so I found my own position as I was doing this particular study to be actually quite complex, because I found myself to be, as I said, both, not simply either one, not simply an insider or an outsider, but in many respects, both at the same time. And what I found was that it was actually a good thing to allow myself to be in a liminal position, to sort of bracket out the whole question of my identity as a way of allowing myself to open up to what it is that I'm studying.
Thank you, sir. And due to the paucity of time, we have many many interesting questions and observations also. So I would like to take one more question by Shantanu De. Uh, just a second, please. Yes, his question is, are there any standard parameters for comparison of religious traditions or ideas across spatial and non-chronological temporal zones?
Nice question, Professor Day. Thank you. Probably Professor Haberman can answer that better than I can. So I would say no, there are no such standards to my knowledge. And to me, that's one of the good things about the study of religion, that there's no sort of independent agency that determines, that sort of sets the rules for making such comparison. I mean, the study of religion, it's constantly undergoing an identity crisis. Is there such a thing as religion is a common question since the beginning of the academic study of religion. Does such a thing exist? And so I would say, fortunately not, to my knowledge. Maybe, but Professor Haberman can correct me on this.